Hey guys, how you going? I'm going to read this one because it came out about 2 days ago, but I've missed it, so I thought it was interesting. And even though they're trying to put a slight slant on it, you can see through it. I can anyway. I just tried to do this video and I had a huge giggling fit right in the middle of it, so I'm hoping I don't do it again because it's inappropriate with a subject like this to be giggling your head off. But it wasn't actually on the subject. It was someone's name that set me off. So I might put that up as a blooper. Let me know if you want to see a blooper. I can't stop laughing. But anyway, there he is there, Epstein and Bill Gates. Take a good hard look, guys. At Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan mansion in 2011 from left, James E. Staley, at the time a senior JP Morgan executive, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, Mr. Epstein, Bill Gates, Microsoft's co-founder, and Boris Nikolic, and that was the name, who was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation science advisor. By Emily Flitter and James B. Stewart. Dated October the 12th, 2019. Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who committed suicide in prison, yeah, right, managed to lure an astonishing array of rich, powerful and famous men into his orbit. Yeah, by blackmailing them. There were billionaires Leslie Wexner and Leon Black, and politicians Bill Clinton and Bill Richardson, Nobel laureates Murray Gell-Mann and Frank Wilczek, and even Royals Prince Andrew. Few, though, compared in prestige and power to the world's second richest person, a brilliant and intensely private human luminary. Sorry, I need better glasses. Bill Gates, and unlike many others, Mr. Gates started the relationship after Mr. Epstein was convicted of sex crimes. So he became friends with him in 2011. Well, Epstein was charged in 2008. Mr. Gates, the Microsoft co-founder whose 100 billion plus fortune has endowed the world's largest charitable organisation, has done its best to minimise his connections to Mr. Epstein. I didn't have any business relationship or friendship with him, he told the Wall Street Journal last month. Remember that? Remember what he said? This is Mr. Gates. I didn't have any business relationship or friendship with him. Okay? In fact, beginning in 2011, Mr. Gates met with Mr. Epstein on numerous occasions. Well, what was it then? Wasn't a friendship. Wasn't a business. What was it? Including at least 3 times at Mr. Epstein's palatial Manhattan townhouse and at least once staying late into the night, according to interviewers with more than a dozen people familiar with the relationship, as well as documents reviewed by the New York Times. Employees of Mr. Gates' Foundation also paid multiple visits to Mr. Epstein's mansion, and Mr. Epstein spoke with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan Chase about a proposed multi-billion-dollar charitable fund, an arrangement that had the potential to generate enormous fees for Mr. Epstein. His lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me, Mr. Gates emailed colleagues in 2011 after his first get-together with Mr. Epstein. Bridget Arnold, a spokeswoman for Mr. Gates, said he was referring only to the unique decor of the Epstein residence and Epstein's habit of spontaneously bringing acquaintances in to meet Mr. Gates. Yeah, right. It was in no way meant to convey a sense of interest or approval, she said. Over and over, Mr. Epstein managed to cultivate close relationships with some of the world's most powerful men. Yeah, by blackmailing them. He lured them with a whiff of money and the proximity to other powerful, famous or wealthy people and young girls, so much that many looked past his reputation for sexual misconduct because they were in on it. And the more people he drew into his circle, the easier it was for him to attract others. Melanie Walker, who had known Mr. Epstein since 1992, joined the Gates Foundation as Senior Program Officer In 2006, she must have been young when he met her. It was one of his girls. Mr. Gates and the $51 billion Gates Foundation have championed the well-being of young girls. I'm sure they have. By the time Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein first met, Mr. Epstein had served jail time for soliciting prostitution from a minor and was required to register as a sex offender. In other words, he sexually abused a young girl. Miss Arnold said that high-profile people had introduced Mr. Gates and Mr. Epstein and that they had met multiple times to discuss philanthropy. Bill Gates regrets ever meeting with Epstein and recognises it was an error in judgment to do so, Miss Arnold said. Gates recognises that entertaining Epstein's ideas related to philanthropy gave Epstein an undeserved platform that was at odds with Gates' personal values and the values of his foundation. Yeah, I don't know about that. If he regrets meeting him, why did he do it over and over and over again? So, okay, Bill Gates regrets meeting him, but he never had a relationship with him? But he went there many times? The first meeting, two members of Mr. Gates' inner circle, Boris Nikolic and Melanie Walker, were close to Mr. Epstein and at times functioned as intermediaries between the two men. Ms. Walker met Mr. Epstein in 1992, 6 months after graduating from the University of Texas. I don't believe that. Mr. Epstein, who was an advisor to Mr. Wexner, the owner of Victoria's Secret, told Ms. Walker that he could land her an audition for a modelling job there, according to Ms. Walker. She later moved to New York and stayed in a Manhattan apartment building that Mr. Epstein owned. After she graduated from medical school, she said Mr. Epstein hired her as a science advisor in 1998. I believe she was one of his girls. What do you think, guys? He may have even sent her to school. You don't know. Ms. Walker later met Steven Sinofsky, a senior executive at Microsoft who became president of its Windows division, and moved to Seattle to be with him. In 2006, she joined the Gates Foundation with the title of Senior Program Officer. Maybe he handed it to Bill Gates. At the foundation, Ms. Walker met and befriended Mr. Nikolic, a native of what is now Croatia and a former fellow at Harvard Medical School, who was the foundation's science advisor. Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates frequently travelled and socialised together. Ms. Walker, who had remained in close touch with Mr. Epstein, introduced him to Mr. Nikolic, and the men became friendly. Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates first met face-to-face on the evening of January 31st, 2011. So it was the first time they met, and Epstein had already been arrested in 2008, so he would have known, at Mr. Epstein's townhouse on the Upper East Side. They were joined by Dr. Eva Anderson Dubin, a former Miss Sweden whom Mr. Epstein had once dated, and her 15-year-old daughter. Former Miss Sweden that Epstein once dated, and now he's dating a 15-year-old daughter? Because that is how he works. So Dr. Anderson Dubin's husband, the hedge fund billionaire Glenn Dubin, was a friend and business associate of Mr. Epstein's. The Dubins declined to comment. I don't know if that's... No, it's Dubin, I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys, in the comments. The gathering started at 8 and lasted several hours, according to Miss Arnold, Mr. Gates' spokeswoman. Mr. Epstein subsequently boasted about the meeting in emails to friends and associates. Bill's great, he wrote in one reviewed by the Times. And that's Bill Gates and Mr. Nikolic. The two men frequently travelled and socialised together. Mr. Gates in turn praised Mr. Epstein's charm and intelligence. Emailing colleagues the next day, he said a very attractive Swedish woman and her daughter dropped by and I ended up staying there quite late. Yeah, I'm sure you did. Mr. Gates soon saw Mr. Epstein again. That was the daughter who was 15, remember? That Swedish woman, her daughter? The Swedish model or whatever she was. And he ended up staying there quite late. Mr. Gates soon saw Mr. Epstein again at a TED conference in Long Beach, California. Attendees spotted the two men engaged in private conversation. Later that spring, on May the 3rd, 2011, Mr. Gates again visited Mr. Epstein at his New York mansion, according to emails about the meeting and a photograph reviewed by the Times. The photo taken in Mr. Epstein's marble-clad entrance hall shows a beaming Mr. Epstein in blue and gold slippers and a fleece decorated with an American flag, flanked by luminaries. On his right, James E. Staley, at the time senior J.P. Morgan executive, and former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers on his left, Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates smiling and wearing grey slacks and a navy sweater. A vast charitable fund. Around that time, the Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan were teaming up to create the Global Health Investment Fund. Its goal was to provide individual and institutional investors the opportunity to finance late-stage global health technologies that have the potential to save millions of lives in low-income countries. I don't believe that. That'd be the left spin of this certain newspaper or certain media outlet. As the details of the fund were being hammered out, Mr. Staley told his J.P. Morgan colleagues that Mr. Epstein wanted to be brought into the discussions. According to two people familiar with the talks, Mr. Epstein was an important J.P. Morgan customer. Really? Holding millions of dollars in accounts at the bank and referring a procession of wealthy individuals to become clients of the company. Mr. Epstein pitched an idea for a separate charitable fund to J.P. Morgan officials, including Mr. Staley, and to Mr. Gates' advisor, Mr. Nikolic. He envisioned a vast fund seeded with the Gates Foundation money that would focus on health projects around the world, according to 5 people involved in or briefed on the talks, including current and former Gates Foundation and J.P. Morgan employees. In addition to the Gates money, Mr. Epstein planned to round up donations from his wealthy friends and hopefully from J.P. Morgan's richest clients. There's a lot more to this story than they're telling us, guys. Mr. Epstein thought he could personally benefit. He circulated a 4-page proposal that included a suggestion that he paid 0.3% of whatever money he raised, according to one person who saw the proposal. If Mr. Epstein had raised $10 billion, for example, that would have amounted to $30 million in fees. Ms. Arnold said Mr. Gates and the Foundation had been unaware that Mr. Epstein had been seeking any fee. She said Mr. Epstein did propose to Bill Gates and then Foundation official ideas that he promised would unleash hundreds of millions for global health-related work. Yeah, and the $30 million was his kickback, I guarantee you. In late 2011, at Mr. Gates' instruction, the Foundation sent a team to Mr. Epstein's townhouse to have a preliminary talk about philanthropic fundraising. According to 3 people who were there, Mr. Epstein told his guests that if they searched his name on the internet, they might conclude he was a bad person, but that what he had done, soliciting prostitution from an underage girl, was no worse than stealing a bagel, 2 of the people said. Yeah, I don't like that evil face. Mr. Gates at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in January. He was unaware that Mr. Epstein was seeking fees. Yes, I'm sure he was. Some of the Gates Foundation employees said they had been unaware of Mr. Epstein's criminal record and had been shocked to learn that the Foundation was working with a sex offender. They worried that it could seriously damage the Foundation's reputation. Well, is that why they sent the workers in instead of having Gates meeting him after that? His employees met with him. Is that because it was too high profile for him to meet? Sorry, guys, had to do that. In early 2012, another Gates Foundation team met Mr. Epstein at his mansion. See? Another team from the Gates Foundation. Because I think they realised that Bill Gates and Epstein being seen together might have been a bit too much. So they sent their team. He claimed that he had access to trillions of dollars of his clients' money and that he could put in the proposed charitable fund, a figure so preposterous that it left his visitors doubting Mr. Epstein's credibility. I doubt that. Flying to Florida, Mr. Gate and Mr. Epstein kept seeing each other. Ms. Arnold would not say how many times the two had met. So they're not friends, and they're not business relations, but they're trying to set up a charitable fund for technology to help people in third world countries? Does this make sense to you? In March 2013, Mr. Gates flew on Mr. Epstein's Gulfstream plane, the Lolita Express, from, I'm pretty sure, did he have more than one? If not, that was the Lolita Express, it was called. Lolita means little girl. From Teterboro Airport in New Jersey to Palm Beach, Florida. According to a flight manifest, Ms. Arnold said Mr. Gates, who has his own $40 million jet, hadn't been aware it was Mr. Epstein's plane. I don't believe half of this. Not his claims, anyway. 6 months later, Mr. Nikolic and Mr. Gates were in New York for a meeting related to Schrödinger, a pharmaceutical software company in which Mr. Gates had a large investment. On that trip, Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates met for dinner and discussed the Gates Foundation and philanthropy, Ms. Arnold said, so they're still going. And in October 2014, 3 years later, guys, Mr. Gates donated $2 million to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab. University officials described the gift in internal emails as having been directed by Mr. Epstein. Ms. Arnold said there was no intention or explicit ask for the funding to be controlled in any manner by Epstein. So, soon after, the relationship between Mr. Epstein and Mr. Gates appears to have cooled. I noticed they didn't say finished. The charitable fund that had been discussed with the Gates Foundation never materialised. Not that we know of, anyway. Mr. Epstein complained to an acquaintance at the end of 2014 that Mr. Gates had stopped talking to him, according to a person familiar with the discussion. A person familiar with the discussion. So no one who was there, just someone familiar with the discussion. I get they're leaving a lot out, guys. The relationship, however, wasn't entirely severed. There you go. At least 2 senior Gates Foundation officials maintained contacts with Mr. Epstein until late 2017, according to former Foundation employees. So there you go. To take the heat off Gates and Epstein meeting, he would send his employees. Ms. Arnold said the Foundation was not aware of any such contact. Over time, Gates and his team realised Epstein's capabilities and ideas were not legitimate, and all contact with Epstein was discounted. Before Mr. Epstein hanged himself in a Manhattan jail cell on August the 10th, he amended his will and named Mr. Nikolic as a fallback executor in the event that one of the 2 primary executors were unable to serve. Mr. Nikolic has declined in court proceedings to serve as executor. Mr. Nikolic, who is now running a venture capital firm with Mr. Gates as one of his investors, surprise, surprise, said he was shocked to be named in Mr. Epstein's will. He said in a statement to the Times, "I deeply regret ever meeting Mr. Epstein. The only thing they regret is that they got caught, guys." Is that it? Yep, that's the end of that, guys. What do you think? Do you think they're telling... I don't think they're telling us the truth. Do you think they're telling you the truth? This is the New York Times. I believe they're letting little bits of information out, but I don't believe they're telling you the full truth. I think there's a lot more to this than what they're saying. And then you've got Bill Gates, who just lies and says he doesn't have any relationship with Epstein, and yet he continues to see him over and over and over again. And then he sends his employees over and over and over again until 2017. Okay, guys, let me know what you think. Okay, bye.